Yeah, this is available for you. You didn't find them because...
Was the most heinous serial killer Kansas has ever seen.
For her life. Yeah, he showed no remorse.
Kill them.
Some serial killers weren't brought down by brilliant detective work. They were undone by a single floppy disk, a discarded coffee cup, or a victim who refused to stay silent. These 10 killers came within a razor's edge of vanishing into history forever, and in at least one case they did. Numbers 10 through 6 on our list: John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Samuel Little, Robert Hansen, and Lonnie Franklin Jr. And not one of them should have been walking free as long as they did. These weren't near misses in hindsight. These were cases where the system looked right at them and blinked. We'll start with the closest calls and move toward the ones where justice came so late, it almost never came at all. That floppy disk, that discarded coffee cup, those are the kinds of moments that define this entire list. But before we get to the killers who came closest to escaping forever, let's start with the ones who still had real distance to cover when justice finally caught up. Number 10, John Wayne Gacy. Gacy operated in plain sight in suburban Chicago throughout the 1970s, and that visibility was his greatest weapon. He ran a contracting business, threw neighborhood parties, performed as a clown at children's events, and posed for a photograph with a sitting first lady. While bodies were being buried in the crawl space beneath his house,
followed the usual getting them drunk and showing pornography and then turning suddenly and using violence or threat.
And shaking his hand at block parties. Police had actually received a complaint about him as early as 1968, and a young man he'd assaulted had gone to authorities. But Gacy served less than 2 years before being paroled and relocating to Illinois, where his record didn't follow him cleanly. It was only when officers noticed the smell coming from beneath his home that the full horror emerged. 33 young men and boys were found buried there. How close did he come? If Peast had never mentioned that contractor's name to his mother, Gacy might have kept burying victims indefinitely. Number 9, Ted Bundy. Bundy didn't just evade capture, he escaped it. Twice. After his first arrest in Utah in 1975, he was extradited to Colorado on murder charges, and in June 1977, he jumped from a courthouse law library window and vanished into the mountains for 8 days before being recaptured. 6 months later, in December 1977, he escaped again, this time from a jail cell in Glenwood Springs, by losing around 30 pounds, cutting a hole in the ceiling, and simply walking out. But on January 15, 1978, he attacked 4 women in the Chi Omega sorority house and left behind a bite mark on one of the victims, a piece of evidence that would eventually match his dental records and seal his fate. The man who had beaten the system twice was finally undone by something he couldn't control, his own compulsion to keep going. Number 8, Samuel Little. Samuel Little may be the deadliest serial killer in American history, and for decades almost no one knew his name. He confessed to 93 murders committed across the country between 1970 and 2005. The reason he went undetected for so long was systemic.
And Guadalupe Apodaca. They were found in the summer of 1989, about 3 weeks apart.
Not accidental. Many of his victims were women living in poverty, struggling with addiction, or engaged in sex work. People whose disappearances were often not investigated with the urgency they deserved, and whose deaths were sometimes ruled overdoses or accidents rather than homicides. The FBI later confirmed that Little's victim count surpassed Gary Ridgway's, making him the most prolific convicted serial killer in U.S. history. Dozens of his cases remain officially unsolved because investigators still cannot match his confessions to specific victims. Number 7, Robert Hansen. Hansen operated in Alaska throughout the 1970s and early 1980s with a method so calculated it reads like something constructed to be unsolvable. He would abduct women, fly them in his private plane to remote wilderness, release them, and then hunt them like game.
Yeah, this is available for you. You didn't find them because...
The isolation of the Alaskan terrain meant bodies were rarely found, and when they were, the circumstances were nearly impossible to trace back to a single killer. Hansen had even been interviewed by investigators and passed a polygraph. He had a wife, children, a successful bakery in Anchorage, the complete picture of a respectable community member. But investigators pressed further, obtained a search warrant for his home, and found jewelry belonging to victims along with a map of the wilderness with locations marked. Those marks corresponded to where bodies were later recovered. Without that one woman's escape, there was no case. There were no other surviving witnesses. The wilderness had swallowed all the evidence Hansen needed it to swallow. Number 6. Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grim Sleeper. Franklin killed women in Los Angeles over a span of nearly 3 decades, with a mysterious gap in the 1990s that gave him his nickname. He was so deeply embedded in his South Los Angeles neighborhood, known to his community, unremarkable in his daily life, that investigators had no meaningful suspect for years. When a full DNA match can't be found in a criminal database, investigators search for partial matches that might indicate a biological relative. A partial match surfaced in 2010, pointing to Franklin's son, who had recently been convicted of a felony and had his DNA entered into the system. Without familial DNA, without his son's conviction triggering that database search, Franklin's identity may never have been established. He died in prison in 2020, with the full scope of his crimes still not entirely known. 5 killers down. Of the 5 killers we just covered, which one came closest to never being caught? Lonnie Franklin, whose exposure depended entirely on his son's unrelated conviction, or Robert Hansen, who had already passed a polygraph when that one survivor flagged down a military truck? Drop your answer in the comments below. Now we move into the top 5, and the margin gets even thinner. These are the cases where the difference between capture and permanent freedom came down to a single piece of technology that almost didn't exist in time, a single mistake made after decades of discipline, or an identity that remains unknown to this day. Number 5. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Ridgway killed dozens of women in and around Seattle throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s. The exact number is still debated, but he eventually confessed to 49 murders, 48 at his 2003 conviction, with a 49th added in 2011, making him one of the most prolific killers in American history at the time of his conviction.
Her son's genitals, and you realize that most teenage boys are having an awful time with dealing with their own emerging sexuality.
What makes his case so striking is not that investigators failed to find him, it's that they found him early and couldn't hold him. It took until 2001, nearly 2 decades later, for advances in DNA testing to allow investigators to revisit that original sample and link it definitively to victims. Ridgway was arrested that same year. He had been within reach of investigators since 1983. The technology to prove it took 18 more years to arrive. Number 4, Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. Rader terrorized the Wichita, Kansas area beginning in 1974. No correction needed. This claim is technically accurate, flagged only as a framing notice.
You will find a homicide at 43 South Pershing, Nancy Fox.
He was a church council president, a compliance officer, a husband, and a father. He was so unremarkable in his daily life that investigators had no meaningful suspect for years. Then in 2004, he began communicating with police and local media again, sending letters, packages, and taunting messages, apparently craving recognition. Investigators warned him publicly that a floppy disk could be traced. The floppy disk, the very object mentioned in this documentary's opening, was his undoing. He knew the risk and took it anyway, which is perhaps the most chilling part of the entire case. Number 3, Israel Keyes. Keyes was methodical in a way that felt almost engineered to be undetectable. He traveled to states where he had no known connections, committed crimes, and returned home. He buried murder kits, caches of weapons and supplies, in remote locations years before he planned to use them, so he would never need to purchase anything traceable near the time of a crime. He avoided patterns. He avoided repeat geography. After abducting and killing a young woman named Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska in early 2012, He used her debit card and forced her to record a ransom video. The card transactions were traced. He died by suicide in custody before disclosing the full scope of what he had done. Number 2, Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. DeAngelo committed at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 home burglaries across California between the mid-1970s and 1986. He was a former police officer, someone who understood evidence, understood how investigations worked, and used that knowledge to stay invisible for decades. He retired from killing and simply disappeared into ordinary life, eventually becoming a grandfather in a quiet Sacramento suburb. That tree eventually narrowed to DeAngelo. To confirm the match, investigators collected his DNA covertly. He was arrested in April 2018 at the age of 72. He pleaded guilty in 2020 and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Without genetic genealogy, he almost certainly would have died unidentified. Number 1, the Zodiac Killer. The Zodiac operated in Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s, claiming at least 5 confirmed victims and taunting police with encrypted letters sent to newspapers. He was never identified. He was never arrested. He simply stopped being attributed and vanished. Investigators have named suspects over the decades. None have been definitively proven.
We're on their first date together.
Michael Butterfield is a world-renowned expert on these murders.
This was a pleasant night, and that was all shattered when another vehicle arrived and a man got out and opened fire on the car.
Some of the ciphers he sent were not decoded for 50 years. One remains unsolved. The Zodiac sits at the top of this list not because he was the most prolific, but because he is the only one here who, by every available measure, actually got away. Every other killer on this list was eventually caught, identified, or exposed, often by the narrowest of margins. The Zodiac was not. Whatever mistake he avoided making, whatever luck held for him when it ran out for every other killer on this list, it held completely. He remains a cipher in every sense of the word.
Zodiac seemed to crave attention, and police feared that publicizing his threats would only feed his ego and encourage him to do even more.
A case that closes not with an arrest, but with a question that has never been answered. 10 killers, 1 who got away forever, 9 who came within a single mistake, a single survivor, or a single technological breakthrough of doing the same. Subscribe for more like this, and watch the next one on screen.